Burst DPS versus sustained DPS versus TTK. Now, between these three terms and the general populace, there is a huge disconnect, especially when it comes to understanding what each one is, represents, and just how overall important a lot of them actually are. Now, there has also been a very large discussion as to how to even accurately test these, and the overall performance of what I've seen from a lot of people is they'll have a conversation that is burst DPS, XYZ is best for burst DPS, and then when they go and test it, the entirety of their testing is done in sustained DPS, which means all of their results are now completely wrong, potentially falsified, or just incorrect in so many different ways that it ends up either being a straight up lie if they do actually know how to test it, or completely misleading if they don't actually know how to test it. Now, a brilliant example of this is one of the ranges. So many times I've asked people about burst DPS and then they come to here and test it on this range, which is no matter what you do on this range, as long as you're utilized the final time, you're testing your sustained. No matter how you do it, how you want to go about it, you are testing sustained. Whether you try and burn down all the targets in a single mag, or if you do it one target at a time, reloading in between, no matter how you do it, you are testing sustained. So if I'm having a conversation with you about burst DPS and you come here, whether you like it or not, whether you understood it or not, what you're actually doing is providing a biased test with falsified results and, in essence, misleading a lot of people. Now, all I'm doing here with a few different weapons is trying to establish a rough baseline. I'm also just trying to get used to the game again a little bit because I've been playing a lot of Remnant 2. However, in terms of overall performance, this is perfectly fine. Now, where I haven't swapped builds, it allows me to test the weapons directly rather than the overall build individually. Using the Police M4 versus St. Elmo's, I have found that my average time to kill for these 6 targets is 10.4 seconds with 1 reload. So if we were to convert this into burst DPS, albeit very loosely, simply because we're trying to average something that's already averaged, and then take our sustain time, remove 1 reload, so we got 10.4 seconds, removing 1 reload gives us 8.22 seconds, which is the total time that we spent in burst. And then to get our TTK, we would divide that 8.22 seconds by the amount of targets, giving us 1.37 seconds. I then also did the exact same thing with the St. Elmo's without swapping build. Average time was about 10.8 seconds, again 1 reload. 10.8 seconds minus 1 reload gives us 9.09 seconds, and then 9.09 divided by 6 gives us 1.52. Now, all this shows is the Police M4 with Flatline has a higher burst DPS than St. Elmo's, but we should already know that. St. Elmo's is really nothing special. Now, this test was replicated, but in an incorrect manner, by another person who shall remain nameless, just because this is an educational video, not me trying to throw shade. They claimed that St. Elmo's has a higher burst because when they tested this, it only paid attention to the TTK number on the range. The numbers they got was the Police M4 getting 13.2 seconds with 2 reloads, and St. Elmo's getting 11.2 seconds with 1 reload. Now, at face value, if you don't know what you're looking at, this would say that St. Elmo's does have a higher burst. However, if we break this down, Police M4, 13.2, minus 2 reloads gives us 8.84. 8.84 divided by 6 gives us a 1.47 second TTK for burst. Then with St. Elmo's, 11.2 with 1 reload, that gives us a burst time of 9.49. 9.49 divided by 6 is 1.58. What this means is, despite this person's claim, Police M4, regardless of what their test was, despite the fact that it was incredibly biased, still has a higher burst DPS. Now, the annoying thing with calculating things in TTK is that you actually have no choice but to calculate it as a pure average. Now, this might sound fine considering when we calculate burst DPS, it's an average. When we calculate sustained DPS, it's an average. However, when it comes to our damage, we are mostly in control. If we lose vigilance, that's on us. We want to get our average burst DPS up. We just wait a second, and when vigilance is back up, we continue firing. The problem with TTK is this is infinitely harder to do because every faction has different health values, and every enemy type within those factions also has a different health pool. Anyone notice that shotgunners are decidedly squishier than a lot of other enemies? The outcast LMG dudes, their health value is closer to legendary than it is typical heroic enemies. The medics have a slightly higher health pool. Shotgunners have lower, like I said. Heavy weapons tend to have higher. And then we can just throw a spanner in the works and say Chunga. Working off of TTK is generally ill-advised, simply just because it is going to change for every mission, for every area you're in, for the RNG of what enemies even spawn. Directives. Are you running rages? Does a Chunga spawn? What veterancy are the enemies? Are they all reds? Are they all purples? Are they mostly purples with a few reds? Are there elites there? Is there a named elite? All of these things are going to absolutely mess with your average. Just to show, a red has 2.83 million health, a purple has 6.36 million health. 5 of each, this gives us an average of 4.595. The annoying thing is though, this 4.595 is 62% off the red and 38% off the purple. Now if we just throw a spanner in the works, let's do 4 reds, 5 purples and 1 named. This now gives an average of 6.29%. This is a 36.84% increase in our average for changing one enemy, which is nowhere near accurate considering the difference in health between a red and a named elite is 598.23%. So hopefully this has explained to you why calculating things in TTK is worthless, which is why we do it in burst. If you want a more accurate way to calculate damage, there is an easy way to do this, and all you do is a simple burst equation. Here's one I made earlier. Now the next part is something that is decidedly more difficult. It is quite simply, we need to find the exact amount of health of what it is we're hitting. Now annoyingly, I only know one of these for sure, which is going to be a True Sons Grenadier woman thing. I believe they just have a normal chevron above their head, and they're always running around going, "Fire in the hole!" They have 9,894,612 health. All we do is divide the health by our DPS. Now I've gone for body DPS here. As you can see, it's come out with 1.59. The actual real number is like 1.592758435579, but we'll just go with 1.59. It's easier. Now, because we're working in per second, which is why we've gone for our DPS, that means on average we will kill this elite provided all of our shots hit and we get a good average or calculated amount of crits. We will kill this elite in 1.59 seconds. And that is literally as far as I can go with this because I don't know the exact health of any other enemy in the game, which is why just in general, we just stick to burst DPS, the bigger the better. Burst DPS quite literally is at any given point, going from point X to point Y, what is or should our average damage output be over that 1 second. And this equation ends up actually being the most powerful metric we actually have to measure the overall performance of a damage style build. It is absolutely not the be all and end all. I am not saying that burst DPS is all that matters. However, the rate in which you are able to kill enemies is directly linked to your burst DPS. The rate in which you're able to stagger some enemies is again directly linked to your burst DPS. The rate in which you're able to break armor plates or shield, again directly linked to your burst DPS. There is more in terms of you kill enemy that is linked directly to your burst DPS than there is anything else. Which brings us quite neatly into the sustained DPS argument. Now, this is really annoying simply just because it depends on the definition of what sustained DPS you wish to go by. And even among the endgame community, no one actually has a straight answer. For example, I personally feel, which I'll get into the reasons why in a minute, but I personally feel sustained DPS is mostly useless. I've had conversations about this with Rousey. He actually agrees with me. He feels that the only time you really go into sustained DPS is going to be on raid bosses. That is literally it. I've had this conversation with IKEA. He has a different perspective on it. He thinks that your overall output is like 60% burst, 40% sustained. When you start a mission, if you were to cut a mission into like, or at least during the times that you are in a firefight, into like 30-second intervals, so for every 30 seconds you basically just tally up the DPS that you did, that at the start of the mission your burst DPS will be more in line, if not just ever so slightly higher than the calculated burst DPSs that both he and I show in calculations. And by the end of the mission you will be more towards the sustained DPS side, and it's simply just because the overall fight length has been drawn out. The longer it gets drawn out, the lower in which that average DPS is going to fall, therefore leading you into sustained DPS calculations. There is also Merc, who is a very, very capable speedrunner from Medkit Clan. He, from what I've heard in the conversations I have had with him, he basically just thinks burst DPS is utterly useless and we should only ever look at sustained DPS. Now, I'm not saying my opinion is more accurate than theirs. However, no one is able to tell me how to calculate the sustained DPS for what I'm about to do. I love and respect both IKEA and Merc. IKEA has a lot more knowledge in game than me, and Merc is a better player. But calculate the sustained DPS for that. I myself am able to calculate the individual shot as well as the burst. The sustained though, I can't, because I have to change the entire equation, which goes against the whole point of calculating accurate burst as well as sustained DPS. You are unable to calculate the sustained DPS for what is happening on screen right now. Now, annoyingly, this is just kind of like a use niche case. However, it does also reach into MMR builds, in which point sustained DPS is kind of null and void. There's literally no point to it even existing, simply because you are doing one bullet, one kill. Now, although we are able to calculate the burst DPS for this, it is also, despite the fact that we are able to do it, it's also not exactly relevant, because we are going into now what is called alpha damage, which is just simply one shot, one kill. So my personal argument as to why sustained DPS actually doesn't matter that much is quite simply all of the equations, alpha damage, burst, TTK, sustained, have to make sense regardless of what build you are running, and you cannot change the equation. With things like Regulus, MMR builds, alpha damage, burst, TTK, we can calculate them all. We can't calculate sustained for these build types. In short, I view sustained DPS a lot like how I view religion. It makes no sense to me, so I don't believe in it. Then we have a rudimentary thought experiment. This is just a random build that I've made up. It's utilising FAMAS, 900 RPM, mag size of 50, reload of 2 seconds. We have our mag damage, our burst, and our sustain. If we reload, we go from 6.2 mil to 3.9 mil. Brilliant. However, all this is doing is calculating the downtime of us not firing with our total mag. So what happens if we replace the word reload with downtime, and then say we got shot and we wait for vigilance to come back up before we continue firing? So vigilance has a downtime of 3 seconds. Luckily during that downtime we can get a reload off, but we've gone from 3.9 mil sustained down to 3.2. What if that thing that hit us was a grenade and it staggered us out of cover? So now we need to get back into cover, use an armor kit, and then reload. Now I am just making this up here, thinking that the stagger from the grenade hit is going to be 3 seconds, armor kit another 3 seconds, and then reload 2 seconds, so downtime 8 seconds. But we've now gone from 3.9 down to 1.8 mil in sustained DPS. Now, this might seem far-fetched, however, sustained DPS is very easily manipulated throughout all of these things, because it is all going to have a part to play. Now, you might notice throughout everything I've just shown here that despite the fact that the sustained DPS has gone 3.9, 3.2 to 1.8, the burst DPS, because it doesn't take any of this into account, is always at 6.2. Now you might say that this is inaccurate in terms of game standard, however, the only thing that really is going to affect your burst DPS is you as the player. Do you have your buffs up? Where are you hitting? What I've calculated in that spreadsheet is just all body shots, so that can go up if you start hitting heads. Then we have this mess, so if we take our elite's health again and divide the health by our burst DPS, we get 1.58 seconds. And then if we then divide it by our sustained DPS, we get 5.37 seconds. Now I can't speak for everyone, only speak for myself, but it doesn't even take me 5.37 seconds to kill an elite on legendary. Now, despite the fact that I would absolutely argue till the day I die that neither of these TTKs are going to be accurate to what you are able to do in game, I will always argue though that the burst DPS TTK is going to be vastly more accurate than the sustained TTK. And that is why I don't tend to get into conversations about sustained DPS, simply just because the way I view it and the way people explain it to me just don't make sense for me. This is also why I get really pissy when I'm having a conversation about burst DPS and someone goes, oh no it's not, look you can do this, and then all of their testing is sustained DPS, and it's just like, so you actually have no idea what you're doing. Awesome. So, to conclude, in terms of what we have and how relevant they are to a variety of different conversations as well as testing, we have burst DPS. Now the failings of burst DPS are going to be player skill, the player uptime, such as is vigilance up, etc, etc. Are you hitting body or headshots? And then the one thing that you can't control is going to be crit ratios. This is why this is the most accurate metric and the best metric in which we measure damage style builds. There are 4 problems, 3 of which you control. Then we have sustained DPS, which has a few of the same problems: player skill, uptime, body or headshot, crit ratio. However, this can be also easily manipulated. It's not just your reload that's going to affect it. No one person has the answer. Not everyone agrees on what sustained DPS is, and because of those last 2 points, this is near impossible to test. I could run one test that says my sustained DPS is XYZ, and then IKEA could run a different test under different parameters because no one knows exactly what it is or how each individual person is defining it, and he will get vastly different results. This is also why we have a very simplified equation that is just going to take into account the reload, which is what the vast majority of people use. This gets at least most people singing off of the same song sheet, so we can at least get an equatable number that everyone can reach. But as for overall testing, yeah, it's impossible. It's not going to happen. Then we have TTK, which takes into account crit ratios. What buffs do you have? Is vigilance up? Do you have FI? What difficulty are you playing on? What specific type of enemy are you fighting? Is it a shotgunner or is it a chunga? Support elements. Is the enemy sat in one of those really annoying Black Tusk healing pools? Are you just getting headshots? Are you hitting weak points? Weak points don't actually change your DPS, but it will change the rate in which you kill something. Is the enemy running? Is it running towards you? Is it running away from you? Is it running laterally to you? And you thought I was done. With your test time, was it calculated on the range, or did you actually calculate the time through math? With your calculated time, did you use burst or did you use sustain? Was the enemy in cover? Because if the enemy is in cover, our DPS just goes to 0, easy to calculate. However, this is going to stretch out your TTK massively. If you did use calculated burst or sustain, how accurate is your burst or sustain calculations? Backtracking slightly, there are 6 major factions: Hyena, Outcast, True Sons, Black Tusk, Cleaners and Rikers. If we just make a loose assumption that each faction has 10 types, that is immediately 60 problems with calculating TTK. Though none of this has any bearing on burst or even sustained DPS. The biggest problem with sustained DPS is we just can't agree. No one can agree on what it actually is. There is also one huge difference that I have not mentioned so far. However, the biggest difference between burst DPS and sustained DPS versus TTK is your burst and your sustain within the parameters already mentioned, regardless of whether you're solo or in multiplayer, will be the same. Your burst DPS solo is the same as in 2-player, 3-player, 4-player, same with sustained. TTK on the other hand, the higher you are in multiplayer, 1, 2, 3, or then 4, you will get massively different results in your TTK. Anyway, I've rambled on for 20 minutes. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.